Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of our podcast. To what extent is China becoming the economic superpower of the world, surmounting the United States and Europe's supremacy and hegemony? Is the question we took to debate. Today, João disagrees, and Javier agrees, will defend their points of view while I'm moderating the debate. My first question, which is to be answered by both of you, João and Javier, is do you believe there was a real American and European supremacy, and if you think Europe could be considered a unique economy, since there are many similarities between the economies of each countries, but also many differences. Why? Javier, you could answer.
Well, I actually think that there was a European hegemony on the when the Europeans had many colonies and had an imperialist power, but then after the World Wars, they were surpassed by the United States. I think the United States clearly had supremacy and still has great power. So I think that yes, we could say that Europe as a whole, if we consider Europe as a whole, and United States had both great hegemony and great supremacy in relation to the rest of the superpowers of the world.
I would like to reply to you, Javier. I think USA and Europe still have hegemony over the control of politics and economics all over the world. Capitalism, that is the main economic system in Europe and USA, is different across Europe. I think there are more pure forms of capitalism. For example, in US, where there is no public health system supported by the state. But in Europe, there are many evidence of more socialist kind of or more less liberal kind of capitalism, like health, education, and public housing is provided by the state. Most European countries became capitalists long after the fall of the USSR in the early 90s, and they banned communism. Europe now dictates and has dictated for long since the colonial era in our history. Dictates the trends for art, culture, and languages. I think, and you can interrupt me if I'm wrong. The colonial past gave Europe an hegemony over the world that cannot be denied. I think.
Yes, but I think that it gave it, but they lost it on the World Wars. The Europe was devastated completely by the war, and then United States emerged and surpassed the Europe, as we can see since some time ago. Yeah, United States was the place where everything was done, where the films were released, where new technologies were released also, where there was all the development, we could say, was from United States to the rest of the world.
Yes, but I still think that Europe and US set these trends. For example, we see mainly Hollywood movies, and we listen to American and British bands or European bands that sing in English. That's the language, the English language being the main language for business, for culture, all over the world. The world shows that Europe still dictates what is trendy and what is not trendy. What is right in politics. For example, UN, the European Union, and the USA control and have power over many countries, and the treaties that US forms with Europe are very important for military purposes, to control and to help regions that are underdeveloped. So my thesis is that US and Europe control politically the world, even though they are not Europe mainly is not it is not the most powerful region in the world for economics, I think. But I will give it to you, Pedro.
Okay. My next question is for you, Javier, and after that, João, obviously, you could reply. How much will be needed for China to become the effective economy superpower, if it isn't now already?
Well, I think China has already a strong market based on low cost products that is inundating the market nowadays. If we can see our clothes, our tools, our computers, our smartphones, everything that we use, or almost everything, we would say at 90-90%, was made in China. Everything has a label of made in China on it. Everything that we use nowadays. So I think China has already got this economic supremacy, but still lacks the cultural supremacy that my colleague João was saying. Still has not the power of setting the trends, setting what people listen, setting what people look when they are at a museum. But I think that this supremacy will come with time.
I agree that China an economic power, but it lacks it lacks several things to become a superpower and probably surmount USA, the USA. I think China has a problem with pollution, many that will cause difficulties to its development. It is estimated that 1.6 million lives 1.6 million people will die every year in China due to pollution directly. That will cause a demographic problem also, but mainly will make the Chinese government spend a lot of money in healthcare. Another problem that I see in China's growth to become a superpower is the small national consumption or national market in comparison with the international market for which they produce. China's production causes surpluses that the national market cannot consume, and it cannot eliminate these surpluses. That will cause obviously the prices to go down, I think, and China relies a great deal in international markets, and if international markets, for example the USA, puts tariffs or a ban in their products, they will suffer greatly from these bans, I think.
Well, actually, this could be true some decades ago, but actually China is doing a lot of effort to help to solve these environmental problems. For example, since 2015, they've been using a cap and trade system on greenhouse gases on their economy, so that the pollution is restricted, and it costs a lot of money to produce pollution in China. The thing is, they have a small national market, as you're saying, but that small national market is growing at an exponential rate. We consider the middle class in China 50 years ago was almost non-existent. Now we have about 600,000 Chinese that are now considered being in middle class, and this group is constantly expanding at a great rate. We can also see that China has so much great development and growth that it is worried because it is expanding at 7% of growth of the GDP by year. Well, actually, the Western countries such as Europe and the United States have a growth of approximately 1.5% of the GDP per year. They are worried because they used to have a 15% of growth of the GDP per year because they were mainly based on exportations, and now they haven't got the capacity of growing that much because the other countries are not accompanying their growth. So actually now China is turning into itself and trying to explore a new emerging market.
Okay, now João, if China won't become the economic superpower of the world in the next years, what do you predict will happen to the world economy? Will the existing economic blocks change? Will the US lose its economic supremacy to other countries that not China?
I would like to speak about this question in specific, a new treaty that was signed by the U.S. excluding China, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Treaty for Economics, that will give the dominance to USA in this region. That was planned by China. In this region, China would become a dominant power, but USA was ahead of China in this market and signed this treaty. This treaty will enforce protectionist measures in these countries and stimulate the consumption only of USA products in. Despite the Chinese intent of expanding to these markets, China is as a policy of financing infrastructure construction in the other countries, namely in Africa. Where Chinese power is evident, and it's undeniable that many African countries are being helped with a counterpart by China, and these external politics, these policies that China is making, this international policy that China has, conquering the world and becoming a superpower and excluding the USA from their former role of controlling militarily and economically the world, will not be achieved because they didn't win the cultural war. Everyone regards the USA as the center for everything, for business, for tech, for culture, and it's very difficult to change this mentality especially in Western countries, that the USA is the USA is the dominant country, and China will not take this role from the USA, because I think, and probably this is a Western vision, that China is seen as with suspicion. They have an authoritarian regime that is good for them because they support the regime, but the other countries need freedom, want freedom, and see the USA as a liberal country that is a sign of freedom, and China is the opposite, I think.
Okay, Javier, would you like to reply to João?
Well, I would actually like to say that this last thing that my colleague was saying of China being regarded as the bad guy, if we could say, is not completely right, because as we see these measures that Trump is applying in the United States, such as the bans on Chinese on the Chinese products, are being highly criticized, while China that has a much more protectionist market in international relations is actually not being that attacked. As we can see, China has a politic of controlling strategical infrastructures in other countries, such as the United States or Europe. They try to buy banks, the energy producing companies, and this really highly important and profitable markets, and they do not let anyone try to invert in these areas in their own country.
Okay, now this question is for you, Javier, and if you wish, João, you could develop this point. Many Chinese people live poorly. Wages in China are low, and that's one of the reasons why companies like to go to China. I assume you agree with that. If China becomes the economic superpower of the world, will Chinese people feel the economic growth? If they do so, it is probable the increase of wages, and then the incentive which attracted companies to go to China will disappear, right? However, the increase in wages will make the Chinese market, that is big now, grow even more, and this may attract companies to the country. What do you think will happen, Javier?
Well, actually, the Chinese role of producing low cost products is starting to decrease, and they are investing on more technological and highly sophisticated products. They are increasing wages, and already some part of the population, that I already referred, that some part of the population that I have already referred, is a middle class that is growing exponentially. 600,000. I know it may be no, 600 million actually. I've said it wrong. Yes, because they have 1.3 billions.
It's a big number.
So
Is that what you're
they
trying
have
to say?
a great middle class, and it is expanding. So the wages are increasing. As we can see, many Chinese now buy high-ended products, and this internal market is growing. I think China will, in the next years, stop from growing on the international market as an exporter, because it is starting to reach the limit of selling abroad, and it will start to turn into itself and try to make its own national market grow.
Well, I think that to reply to Javier, China has a problem that derives from the former communist regime. China has now a special economic zone for big cities that are very alike the Western countries, with capitalist form of
Market.
capitalist market. But many companies are still state-owned, and state-owned companies are less profitable than private companies. For example, these state-owned enterprises and firms fail to return as much profit to their investors, because it's not that is not only the state that owns a big part of the country, but there are other investors that expect profit, and if these companies are dependent on the regime, they will face problem. These investors will expect more profit than they can receive, and these companies fail to give a profit to the investors. In addition to that, the local governments. China is a very big country, so it has local governments. They have accumulated a great deal of debt coming from from the construction of infrastructures that are needed. I assume that, but it made debt a very serious problem. And these governments can deal with that a large sum of money that they owe and that they have borrowed, but they cannot pay. They cannot pay that money that they borrow, I think.
Okay. The debate is almost. Oh, sorry.
I want to develop another thing that these middle class as wants that need to be satisfied. They will increase their consumption, but many people still live in poverty in rural areas. That, for example, in the inwards of China, is still it's still a backward country that needs to be developed. And China is not only Shanghai or Beijing. Is the rest of the country. Many people still live in poverty and are dependent on agriculture. They need to develop that part of the country in order to become a superpower. That's my conclusion.
Okay. So the debate is almost ending. Javier and João, would you like to make a brief final intervention? Javier, you may start.
Well, I actually think that this part that John was saying of there's still many parts of the country that are poor. It's true that there's a lot of poverty, but the thing is, look at China 40 years ago. How was China 40 years ago? It was on the deepest, lowest, miserable state that a country could be. It had almost no literacy. It had a economic power that was really weak. The only thing that China had was a great vast area that controlled. The rest of the things they almost had nothing. So China in these 40 years has grown at an incredible rate. So they now have 95% of literacy. That is a great achievement, I think, because turning an almost illiterate country onto a 95% literate country is a great achievement that they have done. And also this this poorness that is still can be seen is still developing. That's why China is still a developing country. It's not a developed country because it still has many areas that are poor. But the improvements that they have been doing, they are so great that I assume and I expect this to continue, and that parts that are more poor to become richer and to have a better life.
Okay. Jean.
To conclude very briefly, it's undeniable that China is a power, economic power, but it's still a country with a great deal of contrasts. The living standards for many people are very low. To most Chinese, they are very low. They are still the majority that live in poverty. Although there are many people in China that are becoming the number of rich people in the very rich people in China is the biggest in all the world, and this is the trend that will continue to rise. What we expect, and that is a problem, and if it is a possibility also, that the amount of money, the money will be concentrated in just one tiny part of the population. If the government doesn't make the money go to the majority of the people, the people will despise the government that they now support, and they will be forced to change. But to conclude very briefly, China still needs to win the cultural war to become the superpower, and the military war and dominance also, because the role that the US has been playing since the end of the Second World War made their dominance very, very supported and clear. That's undeniable. And China has has accomplished a great deal of achievements, but still has a lot of work to do, I think.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Well, this was our podcast. I hope you enjoyed and learned new things with it. We will be back later for another episode. And don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family.